Before Jim Nabors became the voice of innocence in America's living rooms, before the country boy from Mayberry turned Marine stole the hearts of millions, he was simply James Thurston Nabors, a quiet, humble boy growing up in the steel town of Salicoga, Alabama. It was a world far removed from the bright lights of Hollywood, a world where church hymns echoed through front porches, where laughter was as simple as a glass of sweet tea, and where dreams were often too fragile to say aloud. Jim was born on June 12, 1930. The Great Depression was still gripping the nation, and his father worked in the police force while his mother stayed home with Jim and his two sisters. Life was modest, but the values instilled in the Nabors household were anything but small. Kindness, humility, and quiet strength. Those were the currencies of character. And young Jim, with his shy smile and wide eyes, absorbed it all. Like sunlight. From an early age, Jim showed a peculiar sensitivity. While other boys played rough in the Alabama heat, he was more content with sketching, singing softly to himself, or sitting under a tree with a book. His voice, angelic and haunting, wasn't something he flaunted. It was something he protected. In Sunday school, he sang in the church choir, and every now and then, a parishioner would nudge another and whisper, "That boy's got something." After graduating from high school, Jim pursued a degree in business administration at the University of Alabama. He was a good student, quiet and reserved, never one to cause a fuss. He worked as a typist to make ends meet and sang in glee clubs for the love of it, not for recognition. Then came the move to New York. For a time, he worked as a typist at the United Nations. But the city, with all its noise and ambition, never quite fit his temperament. The cold winters, the endless rush, it wore him down. He quietly packed his things and headed to California, where the sunshine and palm trees offered something gentler. In Los Angeles, Jim worked as a film cutter at NBC. It was a job behind the scenes, invisible to most, but something stirred in him, a longing not just to process the world's stories, but to tell his own. At night, he started performing at the Horn, a small nightclub in Santa Monica that gave stage time to up-and-coming talent. There, Jim Nabors began to blossom. What made him stand out wasn't just the comedy though. His exaggerated country bumpkin character made people laugh. It was his voice, that baritone, that operatic, rich, velvet tone that left audiences in stunned silence. One night in the early 1960s, Jim's life changed forever. Andy Griffith, already a major TV star at the time, walked into the Horn. Andy didn't come looking for a star, but when he heard Jim Nabors perform, both his comedic skits and his powerful singing voice, something clicked. Griffith approached Jim after the show and said he might have a small part for him on The Andy Griffith Show, a one-time appearance. As an overthought, naive gas station attendant named Gomer Pyle, Jim was grateful but had no illusions. Hollywood was filled with small parts that went nowhere. But when his episode aired in 1962, America fell in love overnight. Gomer Pyle was unlike any character on television. He was guileless, goofy, unfailingly polite, and sincere in every way. He wasn't trying to be funny, he just was. Viewers couldn't get enough of his exaggerated golly, and his sweet confusion about the world around him. The contrast between Gomer and the often irritable sheriff Andy Taylor gave the show a new layer of charm. The network took notice. What was meant to be a one-episode cameo became a recurring role. And then, by 1964, its own spin-off, Gomer Pyle, U.S.M.C. At first, Jim was hesitant. He didn't think he could carry a show, and the idea of playing the same role over and over made him nervous. But producers assured him the writing would support the character's growth. And besides, the country had fallen in love. Jim felt a sense of duty, not just to the show, but to the viewers who saw themselves in Gomer's innocence. With Gomer Pyle, USMC, Jim Nabors became a household name. The show ran for 5 seasons and was consistently in the top 10 of TV ratings. But while America laughed, Jim lived quietly. He didn't chase the Hollywood dream of glitz and glamour. In fact, he often declined interviews, preferring privacy. While his peers made headlines for wild nights or scandals, Jim was gardening, or singing, or spending time alone, quietly, writing music no one would hear. Friends described him as the nicest man in show business. Co-stars often said he'd show up early to set, know everyone's lines, not just his own, and never complain. He was generous, too. If a cast or crew member needed help, Jim was the first to quietly offer a loan or a ride home. But even with all the warmth he exuded, there was a sadness behind the eyes, a kind of weight he carried alone. In the 1960s, being gay in Hollywood was dangerous. Careers were destroyed overnight. Tabloids paid informants to out-closeted actors. Studios included morality clauses in contracts. Even whispers could kill momentum. And Jim Nabors, beloved by families across America, lived in constant fear that the truth about his sexuality would be discovered. He never addressed it publicly. He didn't talk about dating. He didn't get photographed at nightclubs. When rumors swirled, including a particularly persistent one that falsely claimed he had secretly married actor Rock Hudson, Jim retreated further. He wasn't ashamed of who he was, but he knew the world wasn't ready. The emotional toll of hiding his truth never made headlines, but it lingered. Behind the warm smile was a man constantly calculating his safety. Every friendship was weighed, every word measured. Fame had given him everything and taken just as much in return. In 1969, Gomer Pyle, USMC, came to an end. Unlike most cancellations, it wasn't due to ratings. In fact, the show was still wildly popular. But Jim had had enough. He wanted to move on, to sing, to breathe, to exist outside the uniform. In the years that followed, he made television specials, recorded gospel albums, and performed in Las Vegas. His voice, which had been sidelined by his comedic role, now took center stage. He appeared regularly on The Carol Burnett Show, becoming a beloved guest and personal friend to Carol herself. But still, Jim remained private, elusive, and always kind. By the 1970s, he began spending more time in Hawaii, a place where people asked fewer questions, where fame didn't matter as much. It was there, in the quiet island breeze, that Jim Nabors found something close to peace. Fame can be a blessing, but for some, it's also a prison. For Jim Nabors, who brought so much joy to others, fame forced him to build a fortress around the most private parts of his identity. To the world, he was the lovable, goofy Gomer Pyle, always smiling, always wholesome, always polite. But behind the grin was a man quietly surviving, quietly loving, and quietly hiding. Off-screen Jim Nabors was a world away from the hype, over-earnest voice of Gomer Pyle. His real voice was smooth, deep, and calming, closer to opera than sitcom. In interviews, when he rarely gave them, he was thoughtful, gentle, and soft-spoken. He never liked attention. Not really. Fame was something he accepted, not something he chased. Behind closed doors, Jim enjoyed the simplest things. Working in his garden, playing piano, hosting small dinner parties, reading alone on his lanai in Hawaii. But every moment in public was calculated. Every question about his personal life dodged. He mastered the art of deflection. In an era when outing someone could end their career, Nabors became a master of survival. In the 1970s, a bizarre rumor exploded across tabloids. Jim Nabors had secretly married actor Rock Hudson. The story was entirely false, the product of a cruel joke played by some men in Huntington Beach, who mailed out fake wedding invitations between Rock Hudson and Jim Nabors. But tabloids latched on like wildfire. It was salacious, shocking, and scandalous. For Jim, the impact was devastating. Rock Hudson and Jim Nabors were casual acquaintances, not lovers. But in that era, association alone could cause irreparable harm. The joke led to a rift between the two men, and they reportedly never spoke again. It was a painful loss, not of a romantic partner, but of a friendship that could no longer be safe. Jim never publicly commented on the rumor, but insiders say it shook him. It reinforced the danger of being seen as different. It was a message, loud and cruel, that even being perceived as gay could destroy everything. In 1975, Jim Nabors met the man who would become the great love of his life, Stan Cadwallader. Stan was a firefighter in Honolulu, kind, grounded, and trustworthy, everything Jim needed in a partner. Unlike Hollywood circles, there was no glitz around Stan. He wasn't chasing fame. He wasn't impressed by it either. He cared about Jim, not Gomer, and for the first time, Jim felt he had found something real, a place where he could breathe without pretending. Their love was quiet but strong. They built a life together in Hawaii, a world away from paparazzi, press junkets, and gossip columns. They took walks. They watched sunsets. They built routines that made the silence bearable. But for decades, they couldn't tell the world. They were a couple in every sense, but not legally, not publicly, not safely. They referred to each other as business associates or travel companions. In private, there was affection, warmth, and laughter. In public, there was distance. It was the price of survival. Jim never talked politics. He never joined protests or gave speeches. But make no mistake, his life was quietly revolutionary. He survived an industry that punished men like him. He gave joy to a country that wouldn't have accepted his truth, and he lived in a kind of double silence, one imposed by the era, and one he imposed on himself. Friends say Jim was often lonely, even with Stan by his side. The isolation wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Living in a world where your love has no name, no ceremony, no recognition, takes a toll. He watched his friends and colleagues live normal lives, got married, raised families, and shared milestones openly. He couldn't. There was grief in that, but also resilience. Jim poured that silent energy into his music. His gospel recordings in the 1970s and 80s are haunting, filled with yearning and praise. Some who knew him well believe those songs were his true confessions, his way of expressing things he couldn't say. As the decades rolled on, the world began to change, slowly, then quickly. By the 1990s, conversations about gay rights became louder. Celebrities like Ellen DeGeneres, Elton John, and others began coming out publicly. Jim Nabors, now retired from full-time acting, remained quiet. Part of it was fear, but part of it, too, was his character. Jim never wanted to be a symbol. He wasn't looking to make statements. He wanted peace. Still, in small, quiet ways, he began dropping hints. In interviews, he mentioned his partner, though never by name. He spoke about the man in my life when discussing his retirement, and by the 2000s, he and Stan were no longer hiding, not from neighbors, not from friends. They were simply together. The industry didn't care anymore. The press had moved on. And Jim, now in his 70s, felt the freedom he never had in his 30s. In 2013, after more than 38 years together, Jim and Stan finally did what they had never dared to do before. They got married. It was a private ceremony in Seattle, just days after Washington state legalized same-sex marriage. There were no paparazzi, no People magazine exclusive, no flashy photo shoots. It was quiet, intimate, beautiful. In a rare interview afterward, Jim said simply, "I'm 82 and he's in his 60s, and we've been together for 38 years. I think every person has a right to marry the person they love, and I'm very happy to have had that opportunity before I died." It wasn't a statement, it was a release. Jim didn't need approval anymore. He had lived long enough to see the world change. And while it was too late for many things, for open red carpet moments, for love songs sung publicly, it wasn't too late for this. He died a married man. Not just in love, but recognized. That mattered. Even after his wedding, Jim rarely spoke about the challenges of being closeted. But those who knew him understood what it had cost. Years of living in fear. Years of hiding the most beautiful part of his life. Years of watching others live freely while he stayed behind glass. His family, the ones who remained close, respected his privacy. But they saw it too. The unspoken grief, the longing for a world that had never existed in his prime. And now, 7 years after his passing, those same family members are finally ready to speak. Not to rewrite his story, but to add the pages he never got to share. Jim Nabors found his true home, not in Beverly Hills or Manhattan, but on the gentle shores of Honolulu. There, tucked away behind hibiscus hedges and shaded by swaying palms, was a sprawling estate perched on cliffs overlooking the Pacific. The home, filled with tropical charm and tranquility, became his sanctuary. Unlike many celebrities, Jim didn't treat Hawaii as a playground. He treated it as a refuge from the noise, from the expectations, from the burden of fame. Neighbors often spoke of seeing him jogging along the beach, attending local fundraisers, or gardening in his yard with no assistant in sight. It wasn't unusual for locals to spot him at the farmer's market or walking hand in hand with Stan Cadwallader, just like any other couple. In Hawaii, Jim wasn't Gomer. He was just Jim, and that was enough. Even in his so-called retirement, Jim Nabors never stopped performing. He continued to sing at occasional public events, his voice, though aging, still rich with emotion. He recorded several gospel and classical albums well into his 60s and 70s, each more reflective and spiritual than the last. His music wasn't chart-topping anymore, but that was never the goal. These albums were personal, full of hymns, reflections, and the serenity of a man finally at peace. Jim also became a fixture at the Indianapolis 500, performing back home again in Indiana nearly every year from 1972 to 2014, tradition that endeared him to a whole new generation. To many racing fans, Jim's voice was as much a part of the event as the roaring engines. Each performance was met with thunderous applause, not just for the notes he hit, but for the heart he poured into them. Behind the peaceful facade, Jim faced his share of health battles. In the mid-1990s, he underwent a life-saving liver transplant after contracting hepatitis B. It was a frightening Chapter 1 that brought him face-to-face with mortality. He recovered slowly, surrounded by the loving presence of Stan and a close circle of friends. Jim was never one to complain publicly about his health. He believed in keeping pain private, choosing instead to live with dignity and gratitude. But those close to him noticed a change. He slowed down. He focused more on rest, nature, and music. In his final years, he dealt with complications from the transplant and age-related illnesses. Though his body weakened, his spirit remained undimmed. He still hosted friends, sang at the piano, and greeted visitors with that same southern gentility that made him famous. On November 30, 2017, Jim Nabors passed away quietly in his Honolulu home at the age of 87. The world was caught off guard. There had been no final interview, no farewell tours, no hints that the end was near. Stan Cadwallader, his partner of over 4 decades and husband of 4 years, was by his side. News of his death spread quickly, sparking waves of tributes from fans, celebrities, and former co-stars. Carol Burnett, his longtime friend, was devastated. She called him one of the most special people in my life. I loved him, and the world loved him. But while the tributes rolled in, one silence stood out. Jim's family. They made no public statements, gave no interviews, released no joint memorials, and many fans wondered where were the neighbors. Had time created distance? Or had Jim's quiet nature been passed on to them, too? Jim Nabors wasn't just Gomer Pyle, and he wasn't just a voice. He was a deeply spiritual, generous man who believed in kindness above all else. Over the years, he donated to numerous charities, quietly, with no fanfare. He helped fund medical facilities, music programs, and LGBTQ+ organizations, all anonymously. He left his entire estate to Stan Cadwallader, a gesture that spoke volumes about where his heart truly lived. For fans, his legacy was laughter. For friends, it was loyalty. For Stan, it was a lifetime of love. And for his family, it was something more complicated, something they had held close for years, but were finally ready to confront, because the silence was never meant to be forever. Jim's last will and testament was thorough. It included his assets, his properties, and specific instructions for Stan's care, but it said very little about his biological family. No public letters, no acknowledgments, no tributes. To some, this seemed like a slight. To others, it was just Jim being Jim, careful, private, and selective. The truth, as we'll soon learn, lies somewhere in the middle. Over the years, Jim had remained in limited contact with some relatives. They exchanged cards, holiday letters, and the occasional phone call. But the public never saw that side. And after his death, those family members, his nieces, cousins, and distant siblings, chose silence. Not because they didn't care, but because they weren't ready. Now, 7 years later, they are. For 7 long years after Jim Nabors' passing, his family stayed silent. No interviews, no memoirs, no documentaries. They chose quiet, not out of shame or indifference, but out of deep respect for the man who had built his entire life around privacy. But time has a way of softening silence. And now, for the first time, those who knew Jim before he was famous, the ones who called him Jimmy, who shared Sunday dinners and childhood secrets, are finally ready to speak. What they reveal fills in the final pieces of a life we all thought we knew. Jim Nabors came from working-class roots in Sylacauga, Alabama. His father was a police officer, his mother, a homemaker. The Nabors family wasn't wealthy or powerful, but they were proud of their name, their values, and eventually, their son who would make it all the way to Hollywood. His 2 sisters, Freddie and Ruth, were older and always protective of him. Growing up, Jim was sensitive, artistic, and gentle, qualities that didn't always thrive in a southern town in the 1940s. But his sisters defended him. His cousins adored him. His mother spoiled him. And yet, when fame arrived, it changed everything. According to his cousin Ellen, now in her 80s, the last time she saw Jim in person was at a family wedding in the late 1980s. He was quiet, she recalls, very kind. He hugged everyone. But there was always a sadness in his eyes. It's like he wanted to be present, but also didn't want to take up space. Others noticed the same thing. As Jim's fame rose, he became more distant, not in affection, but in presence. Phone calls slowed. Christmas cards stopped. Some took it personally, others understood. His niece Sharon explained it this way: he didn't change, we did. We started treating him like a celebrity instead of our uncle. That embarrassed him. I think he pulled back because he wanted to protect his peace. Still, Jim never stopped caring. In old photo albums now released by the family, there are handwritten notes in perfect cursive: miss you, proud of you, hope to visit soon. His love never disappeared. It just changed form. What prompted the family to finally speak wasn't a book deal or a documentary offer. It was a box. Last year, Jim's great-niece Angie was cleaning out her grandmother's attic when she discovered a sealed wooden chest labeled JT. Inside were dozens of letters from Jim, many unopened, some yellowed with age, others filled with pressed flowers, Polaroids, and newspaper clippings. The letters spanned 5 decades. They chronicled everything from his earliest days in Hollywood to his feelings about the Rock Hudson rumors, from his heartbreak over lost friends during the AIDS crisis to the joy he found with Stan Cadwallader. One letter read, I know I don't say it enough, but I think about home every day. I miss the dogwoods, the lightning bugs, and most of all, the way people hugged without asking why. Another, written just months before his wedding, said, Stan has been my lighthouse. He deserves every joy this life can offer. And now, we finally get to call it what it's always been: love. For Angie, those letters were a revelation. I realized the world never got to hear Jim's side of the story. Not really. They saw the character, the smile, the voice, but not the man. And that broke my heart. Contrary to popular belief, Jim wasn't estranged from his family. He simply drew boundaries. He didn't want tabloids sniffing around his hometown. He didn't want cousins fielding awkward questions from reporters. And above all, he didn't want his personal life becoming anyone's spectacle. His nephew Brian put it best. He didn't trust the media to tell his story the right way. But he trusted us. And we honored that by staying quiet. Until now. When asked why they chose to break their silence after 7 years, the family gave a simple answer. Because the world has changed, and we think Jim would be okay with it now. Perhaps the most touching part of the family's revelations is their view of Stan. There had been rumors for years that Jim's family disapproved of his relationship. The truth, they say, is far more nuanced. We never disliked Stan, says cousin Ellen. We just didn't understand their world, but we respected it. And more than anything, we were grateful that Jim had someone who loved him so fully. Several family members say they were invited to the couple's quiet wedding in 2013, not to attend, but to be aware, to share the moment in spirit. He didn't want fanfare, says Sharon. He just wanted us to know that he was finally happy. And that was enough for us. Stan, now in his 70s, still lives in Hawaii. He declined to be interviewed but sent a handwritten message through the family. Jim lived his life in the key of kindness. I was lucky enough to be part of the harmony. More than anything, Jim's relatives want to set the record straight, not for fame, not for attention, but for truth. They want the world to know that Jim was more than Gomer, more than his voice, more than the rumors. He was a man who mailed birthday cards on time every year, even if he couldn't show up. A man who cried when his dog passed away and planted a tree in its memory. A man who, though private, never stopped loving. The family is currently working on a small museum exhibit in Salakaga, a tribute to both the celebrity and the man. It will include his childhood piano, some of his handwritten letters, and photos never before seen by the public. It's time people saw all of him, Angie says. The joy and the sorrow, the laughter and the longing.